Welcome back. This is Lecture 21, Romanesque in France and Spain. We're looking at architecture primarily, which is based on the architecture of the Roman Empire using the rounded arch. That's the main feature to look for, although of course this is the Christianized version of that architectural technique. We notice here on the screen a map that shows the four primary routes known as pilgrimage routes that lead eventually from churches in France, including from Chartres Cathedral, from Vazelay to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. So the idea of religious life in the Middle Ages would be that one aspect of it would be that you would take at least one pilgrimage along one of these routes through the various churches, ultimately ending your pilgrimage at Santiago de Compostela. The second leg of the pilgrimage, not everyone did this, but it was encouraged that you do both parts, would be to go from Santiago de Compostela to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land. So each of the stops along the way would really be a chance for you to venerate different saints in different churches. And so the pilgrimage churches along these routes attracted people who were very interested in seeing the relics of the saints that they had come to worship. That also meant that they were spending money in these individual towns, and it sort of created an economy of sorts that was based around this need to support the travelers as they went from town to town. So each of the stops along the way, one of the goals in some respects of the culture itself was to make sure that the cathedrals were attractive and were interesting and were impressive, and that they housed the bones, relics, objects related to the important saints that people had come to revere. So one of the things that sometimes happens is people of one city may desire to have a particular saint in their cathedral and may make petition, or even in some cases outright steal bones or relics from other places and bring them to the churches here. So some of the churches are in honor of local saints. Quite often the first person to serve as bishop in one of these regions would be beatified. They would become a saint and the church would be named for them. In other cases, we actually have bones or other relics that have been brought to these sites from as far away as the Holy Land itself. So it's kind of an intriguing thing to think about as part of the day-to-day life, religious life of the people of the Middle Ages. Another thing that's important for us to consider is the connection between art and literature. If you've ever read the Canterbury Tales, which is a series of essentially short, often humorous stories, as if it's being told by pilgrims to while away to a pastime after dinner before going to sleep. As they're on their road between one church to the next, as they stop along the way, they're entertaining one another by telling stories. So we definitely have an oral tradition that relates to this pilgrimage concept, and we certainly see the impact of how these ideas and styles of art and architecture begin to affect people of different cultures. We already know a fair amount about the architectural terms. I just want to review quickly. If you are in the central area in the church, the nave, and instead of facing the altar, face the side aisle, you will see the church wall is divided essentially into different sections, decorative and functional. These are not always present, but there are four main to be looking for. The lowest level here, the separation of the side aisle from the nave by these arches and columns, is your nave arcade. The next level above it usually is the gallery, which is a second story area. People could actually be up here looking down into the nave through these openings. A decorative area known as the triforium, followed by this area with the windows known as the clerestory or the clerestory. A lot of the Romanesque churches are going to feature this rounded arch technology, sometimes in the ceiling of the nave as well. When two rounded arches intersect, they create a groin vault effect, and this groin vault, actually, because it allows for the support of the mass of the building above it to be borne more efficiently by these four corners, those four piers. It actually allows us to build a little taller and even to place windows here. So we'll start to see more windows as churches evolve over time. When you look up into the ceiling area where two barrel vaults intersect, you will often see that the ceiling is divided into these four sections. This is a four-part or quatrepartite vaulting system. It's got decorative stone to help accentuate the crossing between the alternate pillars. That is the most common form, but we also frequently see the division into 6 parts. So definitely look for the vaulting to help identify one church from the other. Of course, you know that the church design really evolves from the peripteral Greek temple into the Roman basilica. The major change now with the basilica form into the cathedral form is that we've got our entrance now on the short side. The entrance side is always on the west, and the altar side faces the east. We have, instead of 2 apses like you see here on this basilica, we have only one red end, and we also have the addition of the crossing aisle. So this makes it look like a cross shape from above. Quite frequently, there's a tower built right over the crossing. You often will see additional smaller rounded sections around the apse. These are known as your radiating chapels, and we can put the relics of saints in those spaces. The side aisles separate the nave, the main body of the church, and we would allow people, pilgrims, to walk along the side aisles and then also along this area, which is the ambulatory, which would allow you to visit each of these individual chapels, because usually the main area where the religious ceremony is taking place would be here, where the nave and the crossing aisle come together. So the space back behind that space would allow for the movement of pilgrims without the interruption to the church service itself. We certainly see buildings in the Roman style in France and in Spain both by around the year 1000. You can see that in this example here from the year 1009. The very earliest of our Romanesque style churches will, to some extent, hide the crossing aisle just a bit. You notice sometimes the side aisle is almost as wide as the extension on the crossing aisle. In this particular church, you notice that we have 3 major apse additions, one each on the ends of the side aisles, and then the main one with the radiating chapels in it here. You definitely can see some elevation of this style from what we saw in Rome to serve a new purpose, and see that the issue of getting height is really very important here. The entire design draws your eye upward. The building itself is not enormously decorated on the interior, and these churches, the very earliest ones from the early 1000s, are not really all that decorative on the outside either. I want to focus in on the lintel, the decoration above the main door on the west side of this church, just to show you what the initial architectural carving looks like. This is not very three-dimensional. In fact, it's relatively low relief carving, and the figures are clearly not made to be representational in terms of being accurate in their proportions or attention to anatomy, but again, to really emphasize symbolic nature. It's easy to recognize Christ. You can see the halo has a cross in it. He's holding the Holy Scripture, and he's holding his hand up in a gesture of blessing. All of these are very easy to recognize symbols that help you to understand the story that's being told. The church themselves can undergo changes over time. This is the exterior of Saint Etienne, the floor plan, and the interior. And again, the floor plan shows you how the earliest Romanesque churches don't always really emphasize the crossing aisle from the outside. The nave side aisle's rather wide here, and they make up the same width as the crossing aisle. You can see that we've got 3 radiating chapels here along the ambulatory, and you can see the interior still relies on timber for the ceiling, the interior of the roof. That's going to be replaced by stone for the most part. as we go forward. You can see that here in St. Philibert in Tournes, and you can see the exterior, the westwork, the front of the church, the entrance, still retains some of what we saw in the Carolingian and Ottonian style, this massive amount of attention to the facade and to the towers. But you can see that the issue of making the church impressive and raising the height of the roof is really fairly important. The most important of the earliest churches, of course, is the Cathedral of St. James, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, and this would be both the end of the pilgrimage route for most pilgrims who are staying in Europe, but it would also then be the launching place for those who would be leaving to go on the second leg to Jerusalem. You can see from the exterior, this is the original appearance of the church. This is what it looks like more or less on the inside today, and this is the original floor plan. You can see that the crossing aisle is much more distinct here. We have radiating chapels along the arms of the crossing aisle as well as around the ambulatory in this case as well. This is a church that's extremely important in the pilgrimage history, of course. It is the burial site of the relics of the Apostle James the Greater. Now, James the Greater had been beheaded, in fact, by King Herod, and he was then his body was miraculously removed by angels. And the legend is that the body was then placed in a rudderless boat with no other crew, and the boat made its way all the way to Spain, whereupon the bones of the saint were miraculously surrounded by stone. And so the site of this miracle is now the burial place for the bones of James the Greater. So an important pilgrimage site for a lot of reasons. Many of the bones of saints, as I said earlier, would have been taken from other places. So this one has been definitely seen as the Christian apostle who brought Christianity to Spain. The opening, the entrance to the original church, this is known as the portico of glory. This is the opening of the narthex, the porch at the entrance to the church. And so you can see the original sculptural forms have become really very evolved here. This piece was completed by about the year 1188, and it depicts for you Christ in the center. He is surrounded by supplicants. He's also surrounded by apostles on the side, James being the most important one here in the trumeau, or the central column between the two door entrances. So you can see that he is essentially crowned as he sits in judgment in heaven. He is surrounded by the four evangelists, and you can see the figure represented by the angelic human form, the lion, the ox, and the eagle. We've seen these multiple times already. This is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there's James the Greater. Now, surprisingly, that original entrance to the church has actually been surrounded by a new and much later constructed facade, and that facade was completed during the Baroque era. So look at how elaborate it becomes. So the church has been added to for many, many, many years. And so this is the grandeur of the entrance now. You would walk through here and then through the portico of glory and then into the church itself. So you can see how massively the church itself has kind of grown over time and how the architectural styles have changed over time. So what are these pilgrims going to see? Well, for the most part, they're looking to venerate what we call the relics, which are housed in reliquaries. So the reliquaries themselves are sculptural usually. Sometimes they're more simple box-like shapes, but quite often they are formed into the shape of either a full human figure or a portion thereof, and they contain some relic of the saint that they represent. Now that quite often is a bone or part of a body that has been preserved. So in the case of this one, it houses the upper half of a skull. This one contains bones from an arm and a hand. Kind of remarkable to think that this isn't seen as extremely gruesome, I suppose, as today, but the idea is that you are literally able to see. Of course, you can't touch, but you can pray to or make offerings or venerations toward the actual earthly remains of someone who could intercede on your behalf with higher powers in heaven. So the seeking out of saints was really part of religious life at this point. These are a couple examples of reliquaries that are of more simple shapes. This one's more like an ox, and obviously it has our evangelist symbols on it. This one also looks a bit like an altar itself. But the one to know for the test for sure is the reliquary of Saint Foy. Saint Foy, or in English, Saint Faith, was a very young Christian girl. She was about 12 years old when she was martyred, and she was put to death in a rather horrific way. She was essentially branded and burned, trying to force her to recant her faith, and of course she would not. So she is a very powerful intercessor between the faithful and heaven. And the body itself of this object is made from repoussé. The head may have come from another sculptural form. There's some argument that it may at one time have served as a portrait of Charlemagne or someone in that line, which is kind of odd. Most likely, though, the material was made originally from a helmet from a Roman soldier. It is worked in repoussé, of course, and covered in jewels. She is actually still part of the active life of this church. She is taken out in a plexiglass box and carried through the streets once a year. She has an annual procession, but otherwise remains within the church itself. So this is the Church of Saint Foy, and you can see it is definitely Roman style. It has a pretty elaborate westwork with towers. There's a tower over the crossing, but if you really look at the arches that form the windows and the other decorative elements, are definitely all very round. Now, clearly, this building is much larger than those around it. So the cathedrals, of course, would be the largest structures within any given town. But the need to make ever more impressive architectural statements and cathedrals to draw more pilgrims is going to lead to the cathedrals becoming larger and larger and larger as we go. This is the interior. Now that's already pretty impressive to me. If you imagine sitting in one of these pews, this is an enormously tall structure, and it does let in a fair amount of light from these upper levels. And you certainly can see that your eye is directed in two directions: upward, the upper curving thrust of all of these columns, and then toward the altar itself. The building is really very effective at forming space. If you look again at this exterior shot and think about the buildings people were accustomed to being inside of, it would absolutely transform your sense of space to walk through the narthex and enter the nave. It's also very important, I think, to consider the vertical thrust visually of all of these lines, drawing your eyes up to heaven, and of course remembering that the object of going into a church is to have a spiritual experience. The architecture is somewhat designed to facilitate that experience, to direct your attention to the altar and to direct your attention upward to heaven. And of course, it can't be emphasized enough that if God, in fact, resides in heaven physically above us, looking down on the earth, and the church itself forms a symbol that would show who the faithful actually are. So this is a culture that, of course, for the most part, can't read. So visuals become really, really potent in terms of helping to communicate the ideas of the church. This is no more evident, or is evident in its best form here in the architectural sculptural addition to the church itself. This is the Tympanum sculpture. So the tympanum is the half circle above the main entrance. It is subdivided. Usually this section right above the doors, this horizontal band, can be called the lintel, but the entire structure itself can be referred to effectively as the tympanum. The tympanum sculpture in this case is absolutely meant to teach a moral lesson. You have Christ in majesty, very similar to the imagery that we saw earlier. You can see also surrounding him are figures of angels and saints, and below are the saved, and the damned see that the souls are being judged, and the damned are being cast into hell. And it's a pretty frightening hell. When you take a look at the division here, those being welcomed to heaven and those being condemned, you really get a feeling that the building itself is teaching you a moral lesson. If you think of it as the largest building in the town, that you would maybe be conducting business in the square in front of the cathedral. You might go there for once a week and looking over your shoulder, seeing these terrifying demons. You might decide that there is a way to avoid the fate of the sculptural figures that you see being forced into the mouth of a dragon-like serpent. The sculpture is relatively limited on the interior. Most of where we find sculpture at Saint Foy are in the capitals, on the columns themselves. So instead of having Ionic or Corinthian style carved capitals, we now start to see the emergence of these images that tell narrative stories. Now, of course, they're far too elevated for you to be able to see them easily. So these photographs have been taken from a much higher vantage point than you would normally see them. But they do tell stories that become familiar over the course of studying Christian art. Through the Renaissance, you'll start to recognize certain stories again and again. The nude figure on an altar with an angel interceding is the sacrifice of Isaac. This is Abraham about to sacrifice his son to God at God's request. He then sends an angel to stop him once the test of faith has been passed. This is a really intriguing image, though. This is the arrest of Saint Foy. There she is at the far end, looking very penitent. And here is her judge, who is being urged on from behind the scenes by a demon. It's a pretty remarkable depiction of the influence of evil. The Abbey Church of Cluny is a really important one to consider. The church was actually replaced twice, and the third church, unfortunately, was destroyed after the French Revolution, so we only have replicas that I can show you. But this really gives a sense of the influence that these particular churches had during the Romanesque period. So the Abbey Church implies the fact that there were also other buildings that made up the complex of this architectural structure. And we've seen a diagram similar to this before that included things like medical services, that included the cemetery, that included places for the monks and nuns to be cloistered, but also for guests to be available, for people to have access to food and to create goods that could be sold to support the abbey itself. So remember, this is a site not only of religious importance, but also of education, medical science, and the preservation and transmission of knowledge. So the monks who lived and worked here at Cluny had a massive, massive influence. They were followers of the Benedictine order, and they were very interested in promoting the use of visual images and artworks to help explain the faith to people who couldn't read. The Cluniac tradition was fairly dominant in France and Spain during the Romanesque era. There was a slight alternate to that, the Cistercian order, which was another subgroup of the Benedictine order, but they practiced restraint when it came to the making of images. So the Cluniac order by far is what we tend to look at when we're studying art history. Gives you an idea of what Cluny looked like in the interior, and you can see the rounded vaulted ceiling and the much increased level of height that we've been able to achieve. We've talked about our radiating chapels already, and we certainly can see those here in this diagram. I want to draw your attention to another term, the term bay. The bay is the space between two columns. So it becomes, if we're looking in the nave, this unit here is one bay. And essentially, when we look at any bay, it's repeated pretty much the same way all the way along the length of the nave. The portal is the name for the westward door, your main entrance. We've looked at the Tympanum. jamb statues, literally the door jambs, the left and right sides, these are the jambs. Statues could be there. They could also be here, as we saw with the St. James. The trumeau is the name for the sculpture in the column in the center between the two doors. The lintel is the horizontal element across. The cathedral itself, the term cathedral, I think is probably an important one for us to look at as well. It's more than just a church. A cathedral is literally the seat of the bishops. So not only would you have importance in terms of the relics that are being venerated in a particular church, if you had a true cathedral, then that meant that the officiating priest was the bishop. It was the leading religious figure of that region. So this is an important cathedral. This is Saint-Sernin. Saint-Sernin was the first bishop of Toulouse, and so this is not only the seat of the subsequent bishops, but it is now the burial site for Sernin himself. And you can see that the towers have been kind of minimal at this point. We almost have no vertical beyond the portal, but we certainly have an impressive tower over the crossing here. Our radiating chapels we'll look at in just a second. You can see clearly within this church that we've got a two-part elevation here. This is very definitely Romanesque style. You can tell the round arch in the vaulting in the center space. This is one of the churches I want us to be able to recognize for the test, so I've included a couple distinguishing features to help you recognize it and tell it apart from other churches. Obviously, it is a cross-shaped church. It has a very clearly pointed tower over the crossing section. It's a barrel vaulted nave. It is not a cross groin vault, it's a vault, and you clearly can see round arches there. There's only a two-part elevation here. It's very simple: nave arcade and the tribune gallery above it. So there's no clerestory on the nave. That's another way to recognize this church. I wanted us to take a moment, though, to take a look at it in a little more detail from the inside, so if you'll indulge me. Yeah. This will let us take a quick look at a 360-degree view of the interior of Saint-Sernin. So we are now looking essentially through the choir to the main altar, and you can see the apse behind that allowing light in. I'm going to turn us around a little bit so you can see. Back into the nave. And up, you can clearly see into the tribune gallery. That's not just decorative, but that's a full second level to walk through. You can see the round arch technology there in the ceiling. And let's take a look into the radiating chapels. So here's the ambulatory behind the main altar. So we saw past the altar to the large windows that were letting light in from the apse. So the main altar is above us here, but this is the level of the side aisles and ambulatory. So you can see that you can walk all the way around without interrupting the church service and venerate relics of saints within all of those radiating chapel spaces. So you can imagine how important this type of building was to this religious process. You can see clearly that there are multiple areas to stop and to pay homage to the various saints that are contained within. We should be back now. Okay, so there's Saint-Sernin in Toulouse, France. These are some of the Arnald sculptures from this building. Now, they probably were located outdoors as part of the pilgrimage route and have since been placed within. But you see Christ in a mandorla, very much like the Eastern Byzantine style. Again, there's that blessing gesture, the holding the scriptures and the cross in the halo behind his head, and we've got our eagle, ox, lion, and angelic human figure. So we know that he's surrounded by the evangelist. This is a 50-inch, relatively low relief sculpture, and it makes up part of a series that include angels and apostles also preaching for us. Some of the most impressive artwork of the Romanesque era really is found on these Tympanum sculptures on the portals. This is the Priory Church of Santiago, or Saint Peter, in Moissac, France, and this is another example of the Christ in Judgment, Second Coming. He is again surrounded by the evangelists, Matthew represented by the angel / man, John is the eagle, Luke is the ox, and Mark is the lion. Now, this particular church is set up is part of a priory, but the main portal that we're looking at is actually strangely to the side of the main narthex. So we're actually on the south end. We'd enter through that and then into the church. We'd have to make kind of a 90-degree turn. But I wanted you to take a look at the sculpture in more detail. You can clearly see that foreshortening is not really evident here, that the bones of the leg from hip to knee are angled more downward as opposed to the illusion of the legs coming toward us in space. The figures overall are a little bit overly elongated. The heads are a little bit big. We have a lot of the type of distortion in the figure that was fairly common during the reign of Constantine, and then into some of the subsequent cultures that we've looked at. You can clearly see that here in terms of the heads on these figures looking up at Christ seated in majesty in the Second Coming. The sculptures on the jambs and the trumeau, though, are really pretty fascinating. These are the protective lions of the church, sitting on top of one another to form the main trumeau here between the two entrances. And then there are statues of saints on either side, on the sides of the trumeau. So you can see there those really elongated forms. Look at how long his body is from hip to ankle. So you can see the figures kind of conform to the shape of the column itself rather than to the proportions of the human body. I also really like how elaborately scalloped these edges of the jambs are on either side of the door, and even within the trumeau itself. It creates a really unique rhythm visually up and down that figure. Pretty impressive. So that gives you an idea of how the placement works and how sculptural those forms are. The tympanum we were just looking at, the trumeau and the jambs, but there's also architecture here because this entrance is so recessed. There's sculptural elements here within this element of the architecture, and it's really pretty remarkable. This shows us a story of the death of Lazarus. So Lazarus is dying on this side and being cradled here in the arm of Abraham, and all of this is taking place above these sculptural reliefs that show us the punishments in hell for the sin of greed and lust. So really pretty remarkable sense of teaching us about religion by terrifying us. This is a very different approach, I think, than we're accustomed to in contemporary religious life. We're seeing much more of the consequences of sin as a threat, as opposed to trying to establish a personal relationship with the divine. And it's a very different way of thinking about the religion. Within the cloister area, there's an enormous amount of sculptural relief. There is a monument in relief of the abbot of the priory. We see him here, Durandus, and then these incredibly beautiful but strange kind of mythological creatures carved into the capitals of these columns that support the arcade there around the cloister. I definitely wanted you to get a sense of how dramatic these sculptures can be. Some of them do include text to alert us to their importance. This is the Cathedral Saint Lazare. It is the rest place of the bones of Lazarus. So these would have come from the Holy Land and been brought here to this church, and so they are a major attraction, and in fact one of the major pilgrimage churches. So what you're seeing here is the entrance side of the church. It has pretty elaborate towers at the entrance. There's a very elaborate tower over the crossing. The apse is on this end. From this shot, this is the apse end. So that's the back of the church. I wanted you to see again the westwork so we can see into the sculpture we're about to look at. It is also pretty deep into the architecture, and you can see here overall a shot of what the portal looks like. The main element to know, though, for the test is right here, just the Tympanum sculpture itself. This one has an artist's name on it, and people do still debate a bit about whether it is truly the artist's name or the name perhaps of an abbot who oversaw the project. I tend to believe it is the name of the artist, Gisela, and Gisela has given us another vision, again, of Christ in heaven. He's literally seated on a throne, and the throne itself looks like Romanesque architecture. You can kind of see windows and arches behind him, but clearly there's no foreshortening there in the leg. It doesn't look as though he's seated on a throne and we're looking in at him. He almost appears to be doing kind of a ballet move, bending his knees out to the sides instead of toward us. So the sense of three-dimensional reality, again, very much not in evidence. The body very elongated, the drapery a little more suggested rather than observed. But he is, again, judging souls, and you can see that there are figures awaiting judgment below. So these would be people who've died before the time of Christ, whose bodies are being pulled up from their tombs and being judged. They are judged here by St. Michael. We saw him before on one of the high crosses in Ireland. He's doing the same job here as he was there. He's judging souls. You can see that the demons are trying to tip the scales in their favor to gain more souls for hell. The demons all have pretty scary, gaping, open mouths. There's this terrifying serpent creature curling around their legs, and they are literally stuffing people into a furnace on this side of the sculpture. There's also an inscription above the figures that are waiting to be judged that's pretty gruesome. May this terror terrify those whom earthly error binds, for the horror of these images here in this manner truly depicts what will be. So you are clearly seeing the message. If you can read it, but if you just have the ability to interpret visual images, you can see how scared the figures are as they await their fate. These two are probably the most interesting of the souls awaiting judgment. If you look closely, they're both carrying bags over their shoulders. One has a symbol of a cross, one has a symbol of a scallop-edged shell. And the scallop shell is the symbol of James the Greater, and so this is someone who has made their pilgrimage to Compostela. The cross symbol indicates that this pilgrim has made his way all the way to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land, so probably these souls will be okay. But the thing that I've always found most interesting about this is how very much the figures on the saved side are referencing the Romanesque architecture itself. Everything seems very orderly. Everyone's helping each other. It's very organized, very clean. The side where they're going to hell is the most terrifying aspect. If you really look at the figures of the demons, they're kind of like hybrids of animals and humans in the most terrifying way. And they are, you see these feet right here that the arrow's pointing to? They're literally stuffing people head first into the furnace of hell. It somehow seems even scarier to me that not only are you going to be tortured forever, but you have to do it head first. This is one of the figures being plucked up for judgment by these big claw-like fingers, and his mouth is open, screaming. It is definitely clear, I think, from the sculpture on the tympanum what the main point of the religion is to save your soul and to take action before it's too late. There are other sculptural aspects of the St. Lazarus Church that I thought you might like. This depiction of Eve is rather unique. You can see the suggestion of the serpent to the right, and her hand is on the apple. And then there's also these really interesting capitals. You see here the Magi asleep, flight into Egypt, and you really, I think, especially flight into Egypt would be an image that's pretty recognizable even to the most Christians today from nativity scenes from our Christmas celebrations. You would probably recognize this scene without having to be told what it depicts, and really how the art of the Middle Ages needs to function. A companion to the St. Lazarus Church is La Madeleine. It houses the relics of Mary Magdalene, believed to be the sister of Lazarus. And you can see here the elaborate decoration, sculptural decoration on the portal has become even more dramatic in this space. Above the portal, we've got well over life-size figure surrounding the windows and the architectural addition above that space. Really pretty remarkable. This is one of the starting points for the pilgrimage routes, and in fact a really important church in several ways. It is also the church most closely associated with the Crusades. At least 2-3 crusades were literally launched from this church, and in fact the first crusade, the speech that was meant to inaugurate the crusade was scheduled to be held here, and then a decision was made to hold it elsewhere. So the Madeleine becomes really an important church when we're talking about the Crusades. Crusades essentially were 3 major military campaigns in which the European Western Christians tried to take control of Jerusalem. And they did, in fact, win some pretty significant victories in the First Crusade, including being able to occupy the Dome of the Rock, and then lost ground pretty swiftly thereafter. But it was sort of a symbolic gesture in some ways. It was more of a political, religious, and economic boon in Europe than it was in terms of the direct effect that it had in terms of lasting control of the Christians over all the territories of the Holy Land. The Tympanum sculpture here is really a rather remarkable one in that we're not seeing Last Judgment, heaven and hell. Here you're seeing the Pentecost. You're seeing the miracle in which the disciples, or apostles rather, are given the ability to speak in multiple languages, and they are actually surrounded by images of people from all different cultures all around the world. So this whole sculptural format is about spreading the language and the story of Christianity. The figures look a little more believable, a little more fully three-dimensional, although the drapery is still a little bit over the top. We certainly can see that the world is, from the Christian point of view, is meant to be converted to Christianity through imagery like this. Is very much the message. There are other sculptural forms in the Romanesque era. There are smaller tabletop pieces that we sometimes find, like this wooden Virgin and Child. There are carvings on sarcophagi that are a bit similar to the work that we saw toward the end of the Roman Empire. A lot of the painted wooden sculpture would have been painted, but again, you see that the imagery is much more about the message and the symbolism than about replicating reality. And we see that also in painting. This is Christ in Majesty, a fresco painting from a Spanish church, and it's very similar, I think, to the manuscript illumination that we've been seeing up to this point. But again, you can see a pretty standard format, right? The gesture, the cross, the book in hand, the seated pose is something that we've been seeing time and time again, both in the sculpture and in the painting. Here's the exact same concept painted in a slightly different manner, but again with the 4 symbols you now recognize as the evangelists. So another church that again gives us that same format for Christ, and he's very much in the mandorla that we've seen before. A lot of this does have its Eastern influence for sure, but it's really coming to us from the Italian tradition. Remember that the Eastern style had also massive impact in Italy itself, and it definitely has a connection through the Holy Roman Empire into the area that is now present-day France and Germany, of course. Just in contrast to the Cluniac order, I wanted to give you an idea what the Cistercians look like. And you can see the church is very beautiful, but very, very simple. No architectural, sculptural additions, really. It's a very simple, functional church that's all about the light that comes in through the apse. The painting that we have from the Romanesque era is relatively limited, but here's a pretty interesting one from a church that is, I think, really in pretty good shape. You can see the painting hasn't been completely damaged, and we can still read some of the main storyline, in particular the building of the Tower of Babel, which again would be pretty important. I think this concept of a multitude of languages is an issue for the contemporary Christians really to confront as they're thinking about trying to spread the word to other cultures. Definitely wanted us to look a little bit at some illuminated manuscripts. This is a pretty fascinating case of a manuscript illuminator who is female. This is a nun named Enda, and you see her here working in her scriptorium alongside a scribe. They're literally making the book that you're looking at, and this is another one of her illustrations, which is, again, a pretty terrifying vision of heaven and hell, the judgment of saving and damnation of souls. We definitely have Cluniac manuscript illustration continuing some of the traditions that we've seen far in Carolingian and Ottonian. And you can see that some of these books really do tend to pick up on some of the stylistic ideas of the interlacing and animal forms and patterns that we've seen, but with that particular kind of Carolingian wild drapery and lack of attention to anatomical perfection. You certainly see that in the Codex Calbertinus and in the Gospel from Corbie you see at the right. These are all very much in the Cluniac tradition. This particular example, which is from a book, Moralia in Job, it's the morals of the book of Job, which was originally written by St. Gregory the Great. This was produced at an abbey in France, and it is an example of work from the Cistercian order. So to see the church there at the bottom left, so that's the actual abbey church. The illustration is pretty dramatic, but the Cistercians had a slight difference of opinion. They tended not to decorate the churches with sculptural forms, and in their manuscripts they're a little more restrained. They will limit the illustrations usually just to the initial letter, as in this case here, which is meant to represent St. George, who was a saint who opposed the Emperor Diocletian. He also is very much associated with the legend of Perseus saving Andromeda from a sea monster known as the Kraken, and so he becomes associated in the Middle Ages with this idea of a dragon, and so you see St. George slaying the dragon, making up the form of the letter R. More often than not, the Cistercian illustrations tend to be fairly limited to just the initial letters, and you can see some examples here. So the rest of the work is the work of the scribes in the text. So there may be one opportunity to get an elaborate illustration in, but then the rest of the book is a little more restrained than what we've seen. Sometimes those illustrations will take up a side panel, as you see here. Definitely the work that is most prevalent in the illustration style continues what we saw with the Ottonian, with those little divided symbols separating outward. So this gospel book of Wendricus is kind of interesting. You see the abbot himself here holding the ink so that John can dip his quill to write his gospel, and you see the hand of God holding the Holy Spirit, which is speaking the words to the saint so he can transcribe the word. You can also see his angelic symbol included as well. There's the eagle. just to end the Romanesque section in France, I just wanted you to see some other really beautiful church design that's just slightly off model from the other examples that we've seen. So there are a lot of different variations of Romanesque style in France, some very heavily influenced by Italy, but I thought you'd really like this one in particular. This just has a really elaborate portico, little elaborate entrance that has intriguing sculptural forms in it as well. So you can see that this culture is very much a hybrid of the styles we've seen up to this point, trying to push the art making that is known at this time toward serving a more religious purpose rather than an earthly, secular purpose.